An able man is a man who can do things, and his ability to do things is dependent on what he has in him. What he has in him depends on what he started with and what he has done to increase and discipline it. An educated man is not one whose memory is trained to carry a few dates in history. He is one who can accomplish things. A man who cannot think is not an educated man, however many college degrees he may have acquired. Thinking is the hardest work anyone can do, which is probably the reason why we have so few thinkers. There are two extremes to be avoided. One is the attitude of contempt towards education. The other is the tragic snobbery of assuming that marching through an education system is a sure cure for ignorance and mediocrity. You cannot learn in any school what the world is going to do next year, but you can learn some of the things which the world has tried to do in former years and where it failed and where it succeeded. If education consisted in warning the young student away from some of the false theories on which men have tried to build so that he may be saved the loss of the time in finding out by his own bitter experience, its good would be unquestioned. A man's real education begins after he has left school. The true education is gained through the discipline of life. That is an excerpt from the book that I'm going to talk to you about today, which was published 100 years ago, and it's My Life and Work, the Autobiography of Henry Ford. So back on episode 263, in that biography of Edwin Land, it's called Land's Polaroid, a Company and the Man Who Invented It, in chapter 3, it goes through all the different heroes and people that Edwin Land was studying, like the great people that came before him, that influenced his approach to building all of his work, really, his scientific work and the building of Polaroid. And so it's like there'll be like one or two paragraphs, maybe like a page or two on the people that he was studying as like a young person. He's like 17 or maybe 19 at the time. And it's like people like Michael Faraday, Thomas Edison, Alexander Graham Bell, Henry Ford is one of the people, which is, I'll get to in a minute why I'm rereading his autobiography, and George Eastman. And so what I've been trying to do the last few weeks is like set up, okay, if you had to ask like who's the most influential entrepreneurs of the last 100 years? And I think the top two are blatantly obvious, and it's Steve Jobs and Henry Ford. And you and I are living in the world that Jobs changed, so I don't have to tell you what the introduction of the smartphone changed. You just lived through it. But I think a lot of people miss how fundamentally innovative the Model T was. Henry Ford's Model T was the first mass-produced car in history. Before that, humans were getting around on foot, horse, maybe horse-driven carriage, or maybe a bicycle. Henry Ford was the first person in history to figure out how to produce a car at a price that everybody could buy one. But I like this idea of studying the two most important entrepreneurs of the last 100 years, Steve Jobs and Henry Ford, back to back. So with that, let's jump into the book. Now, this is technically called an autobiography, but that's not really the way it's set up. So the reason I opened the podcast that way, where he says, hey, true education is actually gained through the discipline of life, I think that's how Henry Ford thought about this book as well. We'll learn like a little bit about his early life, but mostly it is like reading this book is like having a one-sided conversation where one of the greatest entrepreneurs to ever live just speaks directly to you and tells you, hey, this is my philosophy on company building. And so let's go to the first chapter, and it just opens up in a very odd way for an autobiography to open up. He just gets right into the main point. Power and machinery, money and goods are useful only as they set us free to live. They are but a means to an end. The fact that the commercial success of the Ford Motor Company has been most unusual is important only because it serves to demonstrate that the theory, in other words, his theory, to date is right. So I'm going to pause right there. He publishes this book in 1922. In 1919, he has bought out all of his investors. He owns the Ford Motor Company. He owns 100% of the Ford Motor Company. And this is at a time in history when he is making like something like half of all cars in the world. A rough analogy of what that would be like today is if you own like, let's say a 10 or 20 billion, something like that, $10 or $20 billion company, 100%. And so he opens up, he's like, listen, I have a lot of criticisms about the way other businesses are built. And I think my criticisms are valid, and they're more, people will be more open to hearing them because I have benefited immensely financially from the system as is, and I still want to change it. So that is what he's talking about in these two paragraphs. Considered solely in the light, I can criticize the prevailing system of industry and the organization of money and society from the standpoint of one who has not been beaten by them. And something's going to be apparent. Henry Ford had a giant ego. And this is like a key thing to think about because it's why it's so important for founders to learn from other founders. Because a lot of the assets to a successful founder and a lot of the things they do are almost in direct opposition of what polite society would tell you to do. And so far, after reading about 100,000 pages of these biographies of entrepreneurs over the last few years, something jumps out, like small egos don't build giant companies. The only difference is some of the founders are better at hiding it, which was the advice Sam Walton had. He's like, listen, I know you have an ego, hide it. He's like, use it to drive you, but don't let people see it. It's an internal driven thing, not something to like strut about externally. But that is just the first line. And there's going to be several of them today where he's just like, okay, I can criticize this. Most of the time people criticizing the way businesses are built and how money shapes society, they're usually the ones that have been beaten by it. And he's like, listen, I can criticize because I have not been beaten by them. At the time this is being written, he is one of the richest people on the planet. So he continues, as things are now organized, I could, were I thinking only selfishly, ask for no change. If I merely want money, the present system is all right. It gives money in plenty to me. But I'm thinking of service. The present system does not permit of the best service because it encourages every kind of waste. It keeps many men from getting the full return from service. And I wanted to bring that up right at the beginning because I'm going to give you an opportunity to jump out. Oh, I don't know how long you and I are going to talk right now. Maybe an hour, maybe 2 hours. Depends on how long it takes me to get through this. I'm essentially just going to repeat his main thing. His main idea is that business exists for one reason and one reason only, and that is to provide service for other people. The note I left myself when I reread that paragraph is everything I do is serving my true end, which is to make a product that makes other people's lives better. I have both the paperback version and the Kindle version of this book. He uses the word service 129 times. And then he's going to echo an idea from his hero. So I just went through the fact that at the beginning, Edwin Land was studying all these other people. Henry Ford, Edwin Land, Steve Jobs, they share a lot of heroes, which is interesting. And so Henry Ford idolizes Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison's like maybe like a generation older than Henry Ford. They wound up becoming really good friends. Like Henry Ford considered Edison like maybe even his best friend. But what he's about to say here is very Edisonian. Ideas are themselves extraordinarily valuable, but an idea is just an idea. Almost anyone can think up an idea. The thing that counts is developing it into a practical product. So Edison was famous for saying, hey, I make a lot of inventions. I'm only interested in inventing things that people want to buy because a sale is a proof of utility. And then Ford says, hey, these are the ideas I use to build one of the most valuable companies in the world. That company just happens to produce or mass manufacture cars, but these ideas can be used in any business. And later on, he gets so frustrated with the inefficiency of a railroad that he winds up buying it and showing. He's like, listen, that playbook I just ran on the Ford Motor Company, I'm going to run on this railroad, and I'm going to demonstrate that the principles they actually work. And he says, I am now most interested in fully demonstrating that the ideas we have put into practice are capable of the largest application, that they have nothing particularly to do with motor cars. And so there's a maxim that you and I have talked about over and over and over again. The way I would compress that idea so you can always remember and take it with you is that you don't copy the what, you copy the how. In addition to his main theme of service, Henry Ford detests lazy people. And he's going to bring this up over and over again. Humans are made to work. The way I'm going to read this to you first, and then I'll tell you what I wrote down right after I read it. So he says, the natural thing to do is work, to recognize that prosperity and happiness can be obtained only through honest effort. Human ills flow largely from attempting to escape from this natural course. So the way I think about that is humans are made to work. The sense of accomplishment from overcoming difficulty is satisfying in a way that a life of leisure and ease will never be. And then he's going to compare and contrast his philosophy, which he sees like the prevailing philosophy of his day. And then I'll have a way to like summarize this and kind of break it down a little bit more because he goes on for quite a bit here. So he says, monopoly is bad for business. Profiteering is bad for business. The lack of necessity to hustle is bad for business. Business is never as healthy as when, like a chicken, it must do a certain amount of scratching for what it gets. So keep in mind, he grew up on a farm, so that's why he talks the way he does. So it's like, business is never as healthy as when, like a chicken, it must do a certain amount of scratching for what it gets, so what it eats, right? Things were coming too easily. There was a letdown of the principle that an honest relation ought to be attained between value and prices. The public no longer had to be catered to. There was even a public be damned attitude in many places. So he's saying a public be damned attitude by business owners. Henry Ford, like Jeff Bezos, was extremely customer obsessed. At the same time I was reading this book, I listened to an episode of Invest Like the Best podcast with this guy named Ravi Gupta, and he said something that was really interesting, and so interesting that I took a note and saved it in my phone. And he says, I think Amazon's culture is largely based on one thing. It is not based on 14. It is based on customer obsession. That is what Bezos would die on the hill for. And I think this almost maniacal obsession and dedication to providing customers the best service at the lowest cost is a way to think about Henry Ford. Because to me, it's like every single, once you really put that into your brain, like every single decision that he's going to make in the building of the company is all going to flow from that one thing. And if he sees a business that doesn't, and this is like the big ego part, if he sees a business that doesn't have that thing, like he's going to talk shit about it. And so that's exactly what he's doing here. The public no longer had to be catered to. He's always going to try to cater to them. There was even a public be damned attitude in many places. It was immensely bad for business. Some men called this abnormal condition prosperity. So he was coming right off of like this big financial boom. It was not prosperity. It was just needless money chase. Money chasing is not business. And so this is what he thinks business should be. It is the function of business to produce for consumption and not for money or speculation. Producing for consumption to the consumer, right, implies that the quality of the article, I need to pause there. Anytime you read books in like this age from like 1900s, 1910, 1920, 1930, for some bizarre reason, and I've read a ton of them, obviously, for this podcast, they use the word article. When he says the word article, it's not how we think of the word article today, like something like a newspaper or something like that. He's saying product. So when you hear article, I will try to, before I even say it to you, I'll try to change it into product, but in case I don't, if you hear Henry Ford say, the article produced, he's not talking about writing something. He's talking about his product, the Model T. So let me start the sentence over again. Producing for consumption implies that the quality of the article, the quality of the product produced will be high and that the price will be low. That the article, there I go again, that the product be one which serves the people and not merely the producer. And so I have the Kindle version up right now. I just realized something. I told you that the word service, it appears in this book 129 times. That word serve or serves is another 55. He's just going to repeat this over and over and over again for 200 pages. So let me wrap up this section. I'll tell you how to think about Henry Ford's philosophy and like something that fits into like a tweet size, like maybe a paragraph size, okay? The producer depends for his prosperity upon serving the people. I hope you don't get annoyed at me. I promise. I'm not like, it's very interesting. This book is, I think, a must read for any entrepreneur. And you can read it really fast. But it's just funny that he just pounds on this thing over and over again. The producer depends for his prosperity upon serving the people. He may get by for a while serving himself, but if he does, it will be purely accidental. And when the people wake up to the fact that they are not being served, the end of that producer is in sight. So I probably read that paragraph, maybe, I don't know, 5 times in the preparation to talk to you today. It didn't just hit me till just now. So I'm reading that. I'm like, oh, wait a minute. There is like some weird thought that just popped into my mind that I forgot. It's going to come from Jeff Bezos. That is episode 179 of Founders, if you want to listen to that. But what brought that book to mind, and I'm going to read an excerpt to you from it in a minute, is where Henry Ford's like, you're going to focus on serving yourself over your customers. That's fine. You may temporarily have success, but one day you're going to wake up. One day the customers are going to wake up and realize there's a better option out there. So Bezos called all hands in the early days of Amazon. And he said, listen, it's because they were worried that Barnes & Noble's, at the time in Amazon history, Barnes & Noble's, they're only selling books. Barnes & Noble's is opening an online store. And this is what Bezos told his team. Look, you should wake up worried, terrified every morning. But don't be worried about our competitors because they're never going to send us any money anyway. Let's be worried about our customers and stay head down focused. And so that's the main thing with Bezos. He's like, listen, you need to be focused on your customers over your competitors. And as long as you're serving them, don't give them a reason to go anywhere else. And if you do that, they won't go anywhere else. So everything I'm reading to you comes across like several different pages. I kind of put it all together. And then this is the note I was really thinking is like, how can I need to like, take this like 500 words or whatever this is. I need to compress this so I can actually take this with me. And so I wrote like, okay, how can I distill what is my understanding of Henry Ford's philosophy? So it's get rid of waste, increase efficiency through thinking and technology, drop your prices, and make more money with less profit per car. Watch your cost religiously. When needed, bring that business process in-house and always stay focused on service. Fast forward a few pages. He's back at it again. Being greedy for money is the surest way to not get it. But when one serves for the sake of service, for the satisfaction of doing that which one believes to be right, then money abundantly takes care of itself. This next sentence I think is my favorite. He's got a lot of good quotes. This is my favorite Henry Ford quote. Money comes naturally as the result of service. Money comes naturally as a result of service. I've probably repeated that in conversation like 100 times. It's just a fantastic way to think about what we're doing. Money comes naturally as a result of service. So then he gets back into this fact that he detests lazy people. And he says, in my mind, nothing is more abhorrent than a life of ease. None of us has any right to ease. There is no place in civilization for the idler. So when I had reread this now, the second time, I read a bunch of now since the first time I read this book, and now, I probably read, I don't know, like 200 books, whatever it is. And I read 2 of them on Winston Churchill. I remember reading this book, this biography of Churchill, and like almost spitting out the water that I was drinking when I got to this part of the book, because he's writing a letter. Churchill's writing a letter to his son. When I got to this part, I was like, oh, this reminded me of what Churchill said to his son. And Churchill, writing to his son, he says, your idle and lazy life is very offensive to me. You appear to be leading a perfectly useless existence. And then the author says, Churchill loved his son, but over time he liked him less and less. Another main idea from Henry Ford's philosophy, he wants to make simple products and he wants to make them at scale. My effort is in the direction of simplicity. People in general have so little and it costs so much to buy even the barest necessities, because nearly everything that we make is much more complex than it needs to be. Real simplicity means that which gives the very best service and is the most convenient in use. Start with a product that suits and then study to find some way of eliminating the entirely useless parts, which is, if you think about it, is exactly what he did. He's giving us advice. He's like, hey, if you want to build a business, you want to build a product, start with a product that already exists, study it, and then just find a way to get rid of the useless parts. Well, he starts out building like $6,000 luxury cars for other people at a time when like the average worker was making like $2 or $3 a day. And he realized like we have all this stuff in the car that's just not needed. And so you can think about Ford's career as like, okay, that's the state of cars now. And so for the next 15 to 20 years, I'm going to find a way how to keep making this simple, keep making it lighter. And then the more simple I make something, the more of them I can make, the lower the price gets. And so there you go. He's just changed literally changed our physical world with his one idea. Henry Ford had one idea. So back on Founders number 120, 121, and 122, I did a 3-part series on Billy Durant and Alfred Stone. So Billy Durant everybody knows the company General Motors. Nobody knows who Billy Durant is. He's the founder. Outside of Henry Ford, Billy Durant is by far the most important other founder for like the creation, the very foundation of the American automobile industry. It's remarkable how few entrepreneurs actually know who he is. So there's just one paragraph in one of these books. It is from Founders number 121. And it just gives you this idea, because I think it is really important to know up front when you're studying Henry Ford that he literally had one idea his entire career, and it was completely different from every other automobile manufacturer. And it says he was determined to concentrate on the low end of the market, where he believed that high volume would drive costs down and at the same time feed even more demand for the product. It was a fundamental difference in philosophy. So why did I bring that up to you now? Because when he's telling you and I at this part of the book, hey, find a product that already exists, study it, and then eliminate the useless parts. He's telling you that, and he's telling me that because that's what he did. And then he talks about this sounds simple, but it takes a long time because you got to do it not only the product, but every single part in the construction and manufacturing of the product. He goes into a lot of detail. I'm going to pull out one because this is important. So at this time, there's like a good amount of wood that is being put into these cars. And so he says, take wood, for example. For certain purposes, wood is now the best substance we know. But wood is extremely wasteful. The wood in a Ford car contains 30 pounds of water. And then this very like basic, it's like simple but not easy. Like his approach to building a business is simple but not easy, right? So it's like, okay, well, this is just one material in one part of a car that has, hundreds, maybe thousands of different pieces to it. And so he's like, okay, well, this seems to be very wasteful. The wood in a Ford car contains 30 pounds of water. And this thought process is fantastic. So he goes, there must be some way of doing it better than that. There must be some method by which we can gain the same strength and elasticity without having to lug around useless weight. And this is the punchline. This is so important and why I'm reading it to you. And so through 1,000 processes. His point is like, I didn't just think about this for wood in the car. I thought about it for every single part of my product, every single part of my business. That line of thinking takes time because you have to do it 1,000 times to different areas of your business. But if you are willing to invest that time, by the time he starts mass producing, by the time the first Model T comes off of the assembly line, he has been experimenting and using this kind of thought process for 20 years, right? So they think, okay, and why is that important? Because by the time that process starts, the game is already over. Game, set, match. Because now he can make a product in 12 minutes that takes his competitor 2 days. And so he talks about, in kind of like a weird, hard to understand way, that, basically I only had one idea. I wanted to make the car for the everyman. I was only interested in trying to get that car, the price as low as possible. And so what he's about to say here is like, really, like, you start with the product, and the product that he wanted to make was the inexpensive car for the everyday man. And then you try to work backwards on how to do that over many, many decades. The place to start manufacturing is with the product. The factory, the organization, and the selling and the financial plans will shape themselves to the product. And that process is extremely long. He says, I spent 12 years before I had a Model T that suited me. We did not attempt to go into real production until we had a real product. So he had made a bunch. I think he made like 8 or 9 different versions of Ford cars before the Model T. So that's what he's talking about. It's like, start with something big and expensive, even if it was cheaper than what my competitors were giving, but it's still not the one idea I had in my mind, what I saw, what I was going for. It took me 12 years of trying to figure out how to get to the point where I can mass produce it and actually make that car for the everyday man. And then I want to point out something here. Like, the great thing about this book is just he's very straightforward. I don't think the writing is great. It's like sometimes you have to hard to understand, but like, he doesn't bury the lead. It's like, this is just what I think, and then he'll give you an example of why he thinks. So he says, the essence of my idea then is that waste and greed block the delivery of true service. Both waste and greed are unnecessary. Waste is due largely, this is so important, waste is due largely to not understanding what one does or being careless in doing it. And the only way to truly understand what you're doing, right, is to do it for a long time and focus on it and think about it. At this point that he's writing this, he's been trying to build cars for 30 years. There's no shortcut. You have to put in the time. There's a fantastic quote by Mickey Mantle that I think kind of like echoes what you and I are talking about right now. It's like, it's unbelievable how much you don't know about the game that you've been playing all your life. And so he's saying, hey, other entrepreneur, your waste is largely due to not understanding what one does or being careless in the doing of it. Greed is merely nearsightedness. I have striven towards manufacturing with a minimum of waste, both of materials and of human effort, and then towards distribution at a minimum of profit. That means profit per car. He's not trying to artificially suppress the amount of money he makes. He just doesn't want to make a lot per car, depending for the total profit upon the volume of distribution. So there you go. I kind of ran over his point there. And then he has like this 4-part philosophy of service. I'm going to save that for the end because he repeats that in the last chapter as well. So I'm going to skip to, he's going to actually give us, oh my goodness. So all we've been talking about is philosophy in his autobiography. Now we actually hear a little bit about his life. And he says on May 31st, 1921, the Ford Motor Company turned out car number 5 million. And he's about to tell us, hey, I've been at this a long time. I'm happy I just made my 5 millionth car. In the Model T alone, he's going to sell 15 million just with the Model T. So he's talking about number 5 million of any Ford car. That's not included, like Model T alone is 15 million, but that's going to happen over the next like decade and a half from where we're in the story. But the reason I'm bringing this to your attention is because like he said, he built a gasoline buggy, which is like kind of like the first primitive car, 30 years before he produced his 5 millionth car. And why is he bringing this up? Because listen, car number 5 million, he says it's simpler than my first car, but almost every point in it may also be found in the first car. This is why I keep saying, like, he literally had one idea. And in every single book that I've read on Henry Ford, like, it just jumps out. He's just like, I had one idea, had no idea how I was going to do it, but I just kept working at it until I got to it. It just happened to take a long time. And then once he figured it out, it's like, okay, well, the game's over. No one's going to be able to produce as fast as possible. And what's fascinating is the fact that he focused on, I don't want to be too complicated because I don't want to direct your attention away from what we're talking about, but there is something interesting in studying the early days of the automobile industry that I think applies universally to other industries. Like Ford took the lead, was the dominant player, had over 50% market share, but that's how good his one idea was. But that one idea led to the giant gap. Because Billy Durant of GM's like, I'm not going to just make one car. I'm going to make like a conglomerate. I'm going to have like a cheap car, a medium car, a luxury car. I'm not going to do all this. I'm going to go out and what he did is like, I'm going to go out and buy all these other existing. He bought like Buick and Cadillac, and I think he started Chevrolet. I don't know if he bought it. I can't remember. But the point being is just like, eventually people got tired of just having the one black Model T, And once they started, then cars became like, hey, your car says something about you and there's all this other things. The entire time that Henry Ford was having success, Billy Durant, and then really Alfred Sloan, because Billy Durant lost control of his company, and Alfred Sloan was the one that brought Alfred Sloan was the one that brought Billy Durant's ideas to fruition in the marketplace. And because GM had better product offerings, once the Model T tapered out, that's when GM had this huge rise. And I think by like 1950 maybe? I don't know the number, but like, let's say 1950, 1960. GM's like one of the largest companies on the planet. And really the takeaway there is like, okay, one industry, you have two legendary founders. They both have completely different philosophies, and sometimes the philosophies work depending on the time. Like think about Microsoft and Apple's like a kind of a good parallel to that. So anyways, didn't mean to go on that tangent. He's saying, listen, that first car, it's like a lot worse, but it's very similar to this 5 million car. And he says the changes have been brought through experience in the making and not through any change in the basic principle. Essentially, hey, I had one idea, I'm not changing that. I'm just getting better at actually expressing that idea in a physical car, which I take to be an important fact demonstrating that given a good idea to start with, it is better to concentrate on perfecting it than to hunt around for a new idea. One idea at a time is about as much as anyone can handle. And now he gets into, okay, why the hell are you building a car in 1893 anyways? It was life on the farm that drove me into devising ways and means of better transportation. For even when I was very young, I suspected that much might somehow be done in a better way. He always says it's like a man should never do something that a machine can do better. Like that should be our main focus. And he starts out thinking about, it's like, how can I get myself out of the physical labor through like building motors on a farm? That is what took me into mechanics, although my mother always said that I was born a mechanic. I had a kind of workshop with odds and ends of metal for tools before I had anything else. My toys were all tools, and they still are. That's a fantastic sentence. The biggest event of my early life was meeting with a road engine about 8 miles out of Detroit one day when we were driving into town. So he's driving into town by horse. There is no cars when he's saying driving, right? I was 12 years old. I remember that engine as though I'd seen it only yesterday, for it was the first vehicle other than horse-drawn. It was the first vehicle that wasn't horse-drawn that I had ever seen. And so he continues talking about the impact that just this one experience had on him, right? From the time I saw that road engine as a boy of 12, right forward to today, my great interest has been in making a machine that would travel the roads. And so that's why he has a love of mechanics, and he considers himself a mechanic. There is an immense amount to be learned simply by tinkering with things. Machines are to a mechanic what books are to a writer. He gets ideas from them, and if he has any brains, he will apply those ideas. And then he's going to give advice, especially for young people, but it applies really to everybody, that, hey, you can't live the life, like your life the way other people want you to, even your family. Sometimes you got to say, hey, shut up, mom and dad. My father was not entirely sympathetic with my bent towards mechanics. He thought that I should be a farmer. When I left school at 17 and became an apprentice in a machine shop, I was all but given up for lost by his father. And so now he's apprenticing in a machine shop, and there's just one sentence, and I think you already know this. I wanted to make something in quantity. He repeats this a lot. I don't want to make 5 cars a week or 5 cars a day. I would like to make 5 cars every 2 minutes. And then this paragraph is, I think I was trying to explain this to you earlier. I don't know how, like, I'll have to listen to it back if I did a good job or not, but I was trying to make this point. It's like, listen, the reason Henry Ford is so worthy of study is because his product literally changed the world. Like the geography, like the physical world, where we live and what it looks like. That's insane to think about. And he says one of the most remarkable features of the automobile on the farm is the way it has broadened the farmer's life. We simply took for granted that unless the errand was urgent, we would not go into town. And I think we rarely made a trip into town more than once a week. And so what's interesting is, again, at this point in history, humans are getting around mainly by horse. So even one of the early criticisms of the early automobiles you'd hear from people, which is, consistent with human nature, history doesn't repeat, human nature does, is that why do we need a car? We have a horse. And Ford is like, I felt perfectly certain that horses, considering all the bother of attending to them and the expense of feeding them and cleaning after them, did not earn their keep. And the point is like, picking up horse shit used to be a job in main cities. Like, there was people, all they did was pick up horse shit off of roads. And so Henry Ford's point is like, what if I just made a product that, never couldn't travel? It traveled just as far and just as fast as a horse. Just the fact that somebody doesn't have to follow it around with a shovel means my product is better. So now he's talking about the entrepreneur environment in Michigan at this time. Let's say this is like the late 1800s. If you were mechanically inclined, there's a lot of people who wanted to build cars. A lot of people were experimenting, and so I've brought this up on several podcasts in the past. But a lot of people are surprised that like the main engines that they were trying to build cars before the internal combustion engine was steam and electricity. Those are like the people didn't know there was electric cars in the late 1800s. But his whole point here is that he repeats over and over again, he's very suspicious of experts, and he feels that if you could actually fill up your competitor's company with experts, that it's a nefarious way to get an unfair advantage. So it says the idea of gas engines was by no means new, but this was the first time that a real serious effort had been made to put them on the market. They were received with interest rather than enthusiasm, and I do not recall anyone who thought that the internal combustion engine would ever have more than just limited use. This is his idea, because he wants his cars to travel far. And steam, first he thought that was super dangerous because it would explode, and electrical cars couldn't go very far. So he's like, okay, well, I'll try to use internal combustion engine, and other people were telling him, was like, no, you can't do that. It's just going to be like a tiny little thing. All the wise people demonstrated conclusively that the engine could not compete with steam. They never thought that it might carve out a career for itself. That is the way with wise people. They are so wise and practical that they always know to a dot just why something cannot be done. They always know the limitations. That is why I never employ an expert in full bloom. If I ever wanted to kill opposition by unfair means, I would endow the opposition with experts. They would have so much good advice that I could be sure that they would do very little work. Henry Ford is very blunt. It actually makes reading his autobiography rather refreshing. I like the simple way he communicates. He's just like, this is what I believe. I don't care if you agree with me or not, kind of thing. What's fascinating is he's doing all these experiments on the internal combustion engine. I'm about to run over my own point. He was doing this while he was working for an electric company. He was offered a job. He's like, at this point, I was offered a job with the Detroit Electric Company as an engineer and machinist. So he's working at an electrical company during the day, and he says, every night and all of Sunday night, I worked on my motor. I cannot say that it was hard work. No work with interest is ever hard. And really, the way you think about it, okay, so he's got a full-time job. He's got a wife. Every night and on Saturdays, right, he's working on this dream of his, this dream of this internal combustion engine. Everybody around him is telling him this is a stupid idea, right? And the way I think about this is like, think about the amount of work ethic put in. He's already told us like, 4 or 5 times up until this point that he hates lazy people who thinks of idleness. And so when I read this section, I thought of what I wrote down is like, if you can't handle the workload, someone else will. And the fact that he not only endured the workload, but he enjoyed it. He just said, I can't say it was hard work. No work without interest is ever hard. He was fascinated by what he was doing. So what's the result? In 1892, I completed my first motor car. Why is that important? Because the public praises people for what they practice in private. He has already been experimenting for years, and we're still decades away from the Model T. This is what he called his first car. He said, my gasoline buggy was the first and for a long time, the only automobile in Detroit. This line is hilarious. I had to get a special permit from the mayor, and thus for a time enjoyed the distinction of being the only licensed chauffeur in America. I built 3 cars in my home shop, and all of them ran for years in Detroit. So check this out, though. He's selling these cars. Obviously, if there's only one car, people are like, well, what is this thing? Who made it? His boss at the electric company tries to get him to give up his experiments. During all this time, I kept my position with the electric company and gradually advanced to chief engineer. I was making $125 a month. But my gas experiments were no more popular with the president of the company than my first mechanical leanings were with my father. It was not that my employer objected to experiments, only to experiments with a gas engine. I can still hear him saying, electricity, yes, that is the coming thing, but gas, no. And this is Ford's point. Remember, we're in 1892, maybe 1893 at this point. No one had the remotest notion of the future of the internal combustion engine, while we were just on the edge of the great electrical development. So everything, like all the energy, the attention, the money, the entrepreneurial energy and spirit is going into electricity. And yet Ford was able to ignore that distraction and with great independence of mind be like, no, I'm gonna focus on this thing because I like it. I'm interested in it. I think it has a future. That's easy to say, oh yeah, think for yourself. It is almost impossible to actually do, especially when everybody around you is focused on something else. And this is where Henry Ford, there's always like a fork in the road in an entrepreneur or founder's life, right? It's like, at some point, none of this is going to work if you don't bet on yourself. And usually you're not in the best position when you have to make this decision, which is why so few people do it. The Edison company offered me the general superintendency of the company, but on a condition that I would give up my gas engine and devote myself to something useful. That's their words. I had to choose between my job and my automobile, and I chose my automobile. This is a crazy thing, right? This is a calculation based on arrogance. There was really nothing in the way of choice, for already I knew that the car was bound to be a success. I quit my job on August 15th, 1899, and went into the automobile business. Why did I say that is a calculation based on arrogance? At this point, there is no such thing as a commercially successful car company. And he's saying, I already knew it was bound to be a success. It gets even more unbelievable. I had no personal money. What money was left over from living was all used in experimenting. But my wife agreed that the automobile could not be given up and that we had to make or break. There was, and this is so important, he's talking about the fact that at the beginning there is no demand. Like, he's essentially describing the creation of a new industry and how humans are likely to react to a change. He says there was no demand for automobiles. There is never demand for new product. At first, the horseless carriage, not even called an automobile, right? The horseless carriage was considered merely a freak notion, and many wise people explained why it could never be more than a toy. No man of money even thought of it as a commercial possibility. In the beginning, there was hardly anyone who sensed that the automobile could be a large factor in industry. The most optimistic people at this time hoped for a development that was akin to the bicycle. So his first car company fails. That's really important to know, because their idea, he still has this idea. It's like, I want it to be available to everybody. At this point, the few people that are making cars, they're extremely expensive. I referenced this earlier, so I'm just going to give one paragraph till we jump into where he starts the company that's successful. The Detroit Automobile Company is the one that he's organized. I was a chief engineer and held a small amount of the stock. For 3 years, we continued making cars more or less on the model of my first car. We sold very few of them. I could get no support at all toward making better cars to be sold to the public at large. I don't want to make a luxury car like everybody else. I want to make a car for the everyman. The whole thought was to make the car to order and to get the largest price possible for each car. He finds that idea repulsive. So he leaves and he's like, all right, I'm going to try to do this on my own. He rents a shop. It's like really like a one-story shed. And he continues his experiments to find out like what the automobile business like really is. Like, what is it at this point? What can I do? And so one of the first things he builds are race cars. And he does that because he viewed racing as a means to an end. Racing is the greatest marketing invention of the automobile industry. It's funny that they're using this in like 1899. Actually, no, I think this is in 1902, actually. So they're using this in 1902. You and I know because I've done 3 episodes on Enzo Ferrari. Like, that's laid the foundation. Obviously, Enzo Ferrari was just maniacally obsessed, like one of history's greatest obsessives. Like, he worked 7 days a week, 12 to 16 hours a day for 60 years on Ferrari because he's an absolutely insane person. Maybe history's greatest obsessive in terms of like, he only thought about that one thing. But my point being is like, he used that same idea. The fact that Ferrari is winning all those races in the 50s and 60s, maybe even the 40s, is what built like the demand. They're like, okay, Ferrari means winning. I want some of that winning. I'll buy that car. So anyways, Ford's doing the same thing. He says, we met at the racetrack in Detroit and I beat him. So it's essentially like, it's a spectacle that the press can cover. And that's how he's getting his initial traction. It's the way you could think about it. His initial traction for these cars that he's making. So he says, I met him at the Grosse Pointe track and I beat him. That was my very first race, and it brought advertising of the only kind that people cared to read. The public thought nothing of a car unless it made speed and unless it beat other racing cars. My ambition to build the fastest car in the world led me to plan a 4-cylinder motor. And I feel it's been a few minutes since he's uttered the word service, but don't worry, he's going to say it right here. The most surprising feature of business as it was conducted in then, and really he would argue now, outside of the Ford Motor Company, was the large attention given to finance and the small attention given to service. That seemed to me be reversing the very natural process, which is that money should come as a result of work and not before the work. The second feature was the general indifference to better methods of manufacturing, as long as whatever was done got by and took the money. So they're like, hey, we're making money selling $5,000 and $6,000 cars, right? The other competitors, or in some cases like $10,000 race cars. It's like, well, what seems to be the problem? Like, we don't have to fix anything. This is great. And Henry Ford's like, no, this is just the very beginning. In other words, a product apparently was not built with reference to how greatly it could serve the public, but with reference solely on how much money could be had for it. And that, without any particular care whether the customer was satisfied. To sell the customer was enough. And when I reread this part, I said, this is what I wrote down. This is why Henry Ford is one of my favorite entrepreneurs. And I mean his approach to work. As a person, he's a creep. I've covered that on other podcasts. And when I read like another biography of him, I'll go into more detail. But that is obviously absent in this book. But the reason that he's one of my favorite entrepreneurs is because think of it from the other side, right? We're customers. Like you and I, we're all building products, right? For other people to use. But we are customers to way many more businesses than, like, we get to make one product, but we have to, one product or service, but we buy, thousands, like an incalculable number of products and services from other businesses all over our life, right? So like we have one company, we are customers of an incalculable number of businesses. Of course, you'd want the businesses that you give money to have Ford's philosophy. Service to the customer over everything. And yet, go think about the last dozen businesses that you've given money to. How many of them had truly great service? How many were making decisions based on what was best for their customer and not what was best for them? And then we get back to this idea of he detests laziness. There's a great Kobe Bryant quote on this. I can't relate to lazy people. We don't speak the same language. I don't understand you, and I don't want to understand you. And so this is Henry Ford's version of that. I noticed a tendency among many men in business to feel that their lot was hard. They worked against a day when they might retire and live off an income. Get out of the strife. Life to them was a battle to be ended as soon as possible. That was another point that I could not understand. For as I reason, life is not a battle except with our own tendency to sag with the downpull of getting settled. If to petrify is success, all one has to do is humor the lazy side of the mind. But if to grow is success, then one must wake up anew every morning and keep awake all day. Life as I see it is not a location, but a journey. And the way I personally think about this is I love the climb. I don't care where the summit is. And so anything that Henry Ford sets his mind to, he's going to be really good at. He starts winning races, builds more race cars, and just builds faster and better ones. This one was hilarious. So it's like he made one. In some cases, he would race them, right? But he's like, this one scares the hell out of me. I'm not going to race it. We got to find somebody else that does. And so they find a guy, and this is a description of him. The man did not know what fear was. So at the beginning of the race, they have to crank these cars, right? There's no electric starters yet. And so our self-starters, I guess what they were called at this point in history. And so the race is about to start. Henry Ford is cranking it, and listen to what this guy says. While I was cranking the car for the start, he remarked cheerily, well, this chariot may kill me, but they will say afterward that I was going like hell when she took me over the bank. And then Ford talks about he's pretty sure that the race car driver never even used the brakes ever. He just went like hell, like he said. He was about half a mile ahead of the next man at the end of the race. And so he uses the publicity of the 999, which is the race car that he's talking about here. And it says this 999 advertised the fact that I could build a fast motor car. And so a week after the race, I formed the Ford Motor Company. He makes a mistake at the beginning because he was short on funds. And he owned 20% or maybe 30% of the company. So he's working on it for a year or two. But we get an insight into his personality. He says, listen, I very shortly found that I have to have control. And therefore, in 1906, with funds that I had earned in the company, I brought enough stock to bring my holdings up to 51% of the company. So really, you could think of in the early days of the Ford Motor Company, they're like assemblers. They're not even really manufacturers. They're buying the parts from all of other companies. They ship them to their, it's more like a warehouse than a factory. And then they just put it together. But even from that, he's like, okay, he was determined. He's obsessed with taking weight out and simplifying the product. He's already mentioned a bunch of times. And it says and this is why, the most beautiful things in the world are those from which all excess weight has been eliminated. And I would argue, same for companies too. This the best expression of this idea, even though it pops up over and over again, I read the music producer's biography, Rick Rubin, right? It's episode 245. And one of my favorite things Rick Rubin said is they would describe him as a producer. He's like, I'm not a producer, I'm a reducer. I take your music and I take away everything that is not the music. The most beautiful things in the world are those from which all excess weight has been eliminated. That is true for a song, a car, and a company. And then this is funny. Whenever anyone suggests to me that I might increase weight or add a part to my car, I look into decreasing weight and eliminating a part. So he just knows human nature. We like to make simple things more complex. So if somebody's trying to get you to do something complex, just fight in the, react vigorously and go in the other direction. It's like, okay, yeah, we're going to add a part. You want me to add a part to increase weight? Actually, I'm going to find out a way to decrease the weight I already have. So not only am I not adding to it, I'm making it lighter and more simpler. In other words, sir, I reject your advice. A little bit about his mindset. In the early days of his company, I would argue he maintained this mindset his entire life. We did not, meaning our company did not make the pleasure appeal. Our ads, or when we teach people about our products, it's not like, oh, it's a pleasure mobile. It's big, luxurious, right? He's like, he's just like, what did Steve Jobs say? Steve Jobs said, I build tools. Henry Ford thought the exact same way. We did not make the pleasure appeal. We never have. In its first advertising, we showed that a motor car was a utility. He just mentioned the need for control. Why is he talk about the need for control? Why eventually does he have no partners? My associates were not convinced that it was possible to restrict our cars to a single model. So at this point, I think they have like 3 different ones. But his whole thing is like, I got one idea. And when I figure out how to get that one idea, when they do the Model T, they don't sell anything else. And so when I got to this point, one of my favorite things that I ever read in any of the books I've covered for the podcast came from Charles de Gaulle. And he says, intransigence is my only weapon. This is the first of many disagreements with other people that Henry Ford has to overcome to remain true to his one dream. And so when his associates convince him to build other cars, this is how he describes it. We scattered our energy among 3 models. He does not like that. And so he goes into detail about like what they're making, how much it costs, how many they're selling, all this other stuff. I'm just going to give you like the highlights here. So 1905, 1906, they're selling models, and some of the models are $2,000 and $1,000 each. And he's like, it's cheaper than like a $6,000 car or a $4,000 car that was common at the time, but he's like, it's still too expensive. And so he's like, at $2,000 and $1,000, we only sold 1,500 cars. And so he eventually goes like this continuous improvement. This is still way before the Model T, keep in mind. But he gets the price down. Instead of 2,000 and 1,000, it's 750 and 600. And this is where he's like, oh, I'm right and everybody else is wrong. Because once he got the price low enough, he goes from selling 1,500 cars to almost 8,500. So what's fascinating is like, even though they're selling thousands and thousands of cars, he's getting closer to his original idea. He's not there yet. The other people, like the shareholders and other people in the business, are like, okay, like this is good enough. But again, Henry Ford's like, no, I just have one idea. I'm glad of the progress I'm making towards it. I think I'm getting closer, but I'm still not there yet. And so he says, we were a prosperous company. We might have easily sat down and said, now we've arrived, let us hold on to what we got. Indeed, there was some disposition to take this stand. Some of our stockholders were seriously alarmed when our production reached 100 cars a day. They wanted to do something to stop me from ruining the company. And when I replied to the effect that 100 cars a day was only a trifle, and that I hoped long before to make 1,000 a day, they were shocked. And he says the temptation to stop and hang on to what one has is quite natural. I can entirely sympathize with the desire to quit a life of activity and retire to a life of ease. I have never felt the urge myself. So again, there's like a little bit of a ego there. He's like, yeah, they thought 100 cars a day was fine. They thought 1,000 cars a day was crazy. He's like, listen, I understand. It's very natural. You don't want to mess up what you have. I sympathize your desire to kind of take it easy. But that's not why I'm here. I have never felt the urge myself. And he continues, it was, however, no part of my plan to do anything of that sort. I regarded our progress merely as an invitation to do more. And why is that? Because he says, I had been planning every day through these years towards a universal car, and we are not there yet. So therefore, we are not stopping. And so now we get to his, Henry Ford's iPhone. So you can think of it, I designed 8 models before the Model T. I made the following announcement. I will build, this is him quoting himself, I will build a motor car for the great multitude. It will be large enough for a family, but small enough for the individual to run and care for. It will be constructed of the best materials and by the best men to be hired after the simplest designs that modern engineering can devise. But it will be so low in price that no man making a good salary will be unable to own one. That is Henry Ford's one single idea. It will be so low in price that no man making a good salary would be unable to own one. He has to, the important part is it's easy to just say, oh, just make my product cheaper. But he's like, I don't want to make a low quality cheap product. I want to make a high quality cheap product. And so for there, he's literally got to invent the ability to mass produce cars, which did not exist before Henry Ford. So he makes this statement, they runs this ad, and it says the question was already being asked. How soon will Ford blow up? Nobody knows how many thousand times it has been asked since. It is asked only because of the failure to grasp that a principle rather than an individual is at work, and that the principle is so simple that it seems mysterious. And so then he goes into there's a million different decisions he has to make and a million different processes that he has to examine and just continuously improve over and over again. And you do that for decade after decade, and you get to be able to build a high quality product at a price nobody can match. But the way his brain works is very similar to the way Rockefeller's brain works. And so, for example, he's talking about the layout of the factory and the workflow, and he says, hey, if we can save 10 steps a day for each of the 12,000 employees that I have, you will save 50 miles of wasted motion and misspent energy every day. So that's his idea. It's like Ford's focus on the continuous improvement as his company scaled, right? It's going to remind you of when I just reread Titan. It's episode 248. And Henry Ford and Rockefeller understood this. Like, these little things make a big difference because our organizations are going to be gigantic. And so Rockefeller's watching a machine that would like solder caps to cans. And he's like, how many drops of solder do you use on each can? And the guy's like, we use 40. And he's like, have you tried 38? Rockefeller asked. And the guy's like, no, but I will. And so he tries 38 drops, and a small percentage of the cans leaked. So that doesn't work. But then they try 39 instead of 40, and none of them leaked. And so at 39 drops of solder became the new standard at Standard Oil, at all the Standard Oil refineries. And why is that important? Rockefeller is going to tell us right now that one drop of solder, and I'm most likely pronouncing that word incorrectly, by the way, that one drop saved $2,500 the first year, but that export business kept on increasing after that and doubled and then quadrupled and then became immensely greater than what it was. And the savings has steadily gone along, one drop on each can, and now has amounted since to many hundreds of $1,000s every year. One drop on one process, on one tiny part of a gigantic enterprise. That is how Rockefeller and Ford thought. Then we go back to this idea because he repeats it over and over again. He says, like, if you actually know what you're doing, you would never consider yourself an expert. None of our men are experts. We have most unfortunately found it necessary to get rid of a man as soon as he thinks that he's an expert. Because this is such a good line. Check this out. No one ever considers himself an expert if he really knows his job. A man who knows a job sees so much more to be done than he has done, that he is always pressing forward and never gives up an instant of thought to how good and how efficient he is. Thinking always ahead, thinking always of trying to do more, brings a state of mind in which nothing is impossible. The moment one gets into an expert state of mind, a great number of things become impossible. Summarize that. No one is an expert if he truly knows his job. This is another. I just love his unapologetic level of optimism that he has, and probably mostly for his own skill set and thoughts, especially when you hear the way he talks about other people. But this is one of my favorite Henry Ford quotes. I refuse to recognize that there are impossibilities. I cannot discover that anyone knows enough about anything on this earth definitively to say what is and what is not possible. And so, of course, if you believe that, you're always focused on this continuous improvement in every little aspect of your business, right? Not a single operation is ever considered as being done in the best or cheapest way in our company. What is that? What is he saying? Things can always be done better. He just says it with more words than he needs to. Not a single operation is ever considered as being done in the best or cheapest way in our company. Things can always be done better. That is the idea behind that sentence. And so a main theme in the history of entrepreneurship is that repetition is persuasive. I've now moved 20 pages ahead of where we just were. And he's still at it. We are never satisfied with the way that everything is done in any part of the organization. We always think it ought to be done better and that eventually it will be done better. And why? 1 cent saved on each part would amount to millions a year. Therefore, in comparing savings, the calculations are carried out to the 1,000th part of a cent. That is how far he takes things. My improvements may be so minuscule that I cannot even calculate them unless I take out my calculations to the 1,000th part of a cent. Imagine trying to compete with this guy. Then he has a bunch of one-liners and maxims spread throughout the entire book. This one I love because essentially when you're studying history, that's what you're doing. It's I don't care what we think human nature is or it ought to be. It's what is it? Well, just read it. Like if you're reading these books, it's like you're watching tape. It's like the same way a basketball player watches tape, game tape, or any kind of athlete watches game tape. That's what reading biographies is. We're just watching game tape of some of the greatest people in history, like how they did life, right? And he says there are far too many assumptions about what human nature ought to be and not enough research into what it is. Another one-liner. The habit of acting short-sightedly is a hard habit to break. Another one-liner. There will never be a system invented which will do away with the necessity of work. Idle hands and minds were never intended for any one of us. Work is our sanity, our self-respect, and our salvation. Then he takes this same idea and he applies it to a different domain. He's like, listen, the reason that I'm preaching continuous improvement, and I'm kind of like maniacally obsessed with this stuff, because his whole point is like, listen, continuous improvement makes your business likely to survive economic downturns. There is no use waiting around for business to improve in an economic slump. If a manufacturer wants to perform his function, he must get his price down to what people will pay. There is always, no matter what the condition, a price that people can and will pay for a necessity. And always, if the will is there, the price can be met. It cannot be met by lowering quality. It has to be met by lowering price. And the way he lowers prices is because he eliminates waste. And so that all these ideas, like it's kind of like a snake eating its tail, right? Continuous improvement means less waste. Less waste means lower prices. Lower prices means that you can survive. Your business is more likely to survive economic downturns. And then once I got to this part for the second time, I wrote to myself, this is when I realized that this book is less of an autobiography and more of a manifesto. There are short-sighted men who cannot see that business is bigger than any one man's interest. Business is a process of give and take. Live and let live. It is a cooperation among many forces and interests. Whenever you find a man who believes that business is a river, whose beneficial flow ought to stop as soon as it reaches him, you find a man who thinks he can keep business alive by stopping its circulation. And what is the circulation of business to Henry Ford? Service to others. Let's go back to this idea where he told us earlier, hey, start with the product, and everything that the business needs, that product needs, right? That, in other words, that we call business, will appear around it. And it also clarifies your thinking. He says, you will notice that the reduction of price comes first. We have never considered any cost as fixed. Therefore, we will first reduce the price to a point where we believe more sales will result. Then we go ahead and try to make that price. So really, what is he saying at this point in the book? If we had to sell the Model T for only $300, and right now it costs $490, how would we be able to do it? Well, one way to force ourselves to figure that out is, hey, the price is now $300. How do we make that happen? A large part of the book is the fact that he feels a lot of people confuse finance and business. He does not feel finance is business. There's a lot of these opinions where he's like, you need so much financing because your business sucks. It's basically what he says. We have demonstrated that we did not need any money. And why is he saying that at this point? Because he's like, my business is throwing off oodles of cash. I don't even know what to do with it. And so he's going to elaborate on his philosophy. He says, money is only a tool in business. It is just a part of the machinery. You might as well borrow 100,000 lathes as $100,000 if there's trouble inside your business. So lathe is just a machine for like shaping wood or metal or something else you would need in the manufacturing process. So he's like, okay, you might as well borrow 100,000 lathes as $100,000 if the trouble is inside your business. More lathes will not cure it. Neither will more money. So his point is like he's analyzing the way that a lot of financing has been done. He's also talks about like this is a big problem in the railroad industry, and why he bought a railroad at one point is because like they have a crappy business that's mismanaged and wasteful, and then they throw more money at it. And that's not what you do. His opinion is like you solve the problem first, and usually the financing that you need is in the elimination of the waste, right? So it says more lathes will not cure it. Neither will more money. Only heavier doses of brains and thought and wise courage can cure. A business that misuses what it has will continue to misuse what it can get. The point is, cure the misuse. When that is done, the business will begin to make its own money. He continues that, hey, this environment, this easy money environment is not helping any. Borrowing may easily become an excuse for not boring into the trouble within your business. And his point is like, okay, your business is going through difficult financial times. Good. Problems are just opportunities in workflows. And many a businessman should thank his stars for the pinch, the economic pinch, which showed him that his best capital was in his own brains and not in bank loans. And so there's this idea that all a business is a problem-solving machine. This came from, I did this book, who knows, 4 years ago. It's Danny Meyer's fantastic autobiography. It's called Setting the Table. And he's at like a dinner with the guy from this guy named Stanley Marcus from Neiman Marcus. And he's a much older gentleman, if I remember correctly. And Danny's like, just like down and out about a problem. And so I'm going to read from that book right now. And he says, opening this new restaurant, I said, might be the worst mistake I've ever made. Stanley set his martini down, looked me in the eye and said, so you made a mistake? You need to understand something important and listen to me carefully. The road to success is paved with mistakes well handled. His words remain with me through the night. I repeated them over and over to myself, and it led to a turning point in the way I approached my business. Stanley's lesson reminded me of something my grandfather had told me. The definition of a business is problems. Business is problems. His philosophy came down to a simple fact of business life. Success lies not in the elimination of problems, but in the art of profitable problem solving. The best companies are those that distinguish themselves by solving problems most effectively. The way I think about this idea is business is problems, and successful companies are just effective problem-solving machines. And that is the point that Henry Ford is making. You should thank your stars for the problem that you're having, because once you solve it, you will now have better problem-solving abilities. And therefore, it's likely over time that your company becomes more successful as a result of you being forced into this very difficult position to actually grow and acquire these new skills, because business is problems. And the reason that Ford is so fanatically obsessed with continuous improvement and continuous problem solving is because his view is completely counter to anybody else in business at this point. And he talks about this. Old-time business went on the doctrine that prices should always be kept to the highest point at which people will buy. My business has taken the opposite view. And so what I wrote here is Ford would not agree with Warren Buffett. Ford would say just because you can raise prices on See's candy, and it doesn't, like, sales don't go down and more people buy, doesn't mean that you should. Ford and Buffett are playing different games. Another main point of Ford. He's like, listen, I want low prices and high wages, and this is why. This is fantastic. There's something sacred about wages. They represent homes and families and domestic destinies. People ought to tread very carefully when approaching wages. On the cost sheet, wages are mere numbers. They're mere figures. Out in the world, wages are bread boxes and coal bins, babies' cradles and children's education, family comforts and contentment. What he's really telling you and I here is never forget the people behind the wages you pay. Wages aren't the same as your other expenses. There is a ruthlessness that Henry Ford definitely has, though, and his point is everything and everybody must produce or get out. What is he talking about there? In a company that's dedicated to service, there's no room for waste. And he has an entire paragraph dedicated to one of my favorite lines. Read George Lucas's fantastic biography. It's called George Lucas: A Life. The writer is Brian J. Jones. I think it's founder's number 35. But there's a line in that book I never forgot, and he says, George Lucas unapologetically invested in what he believed in most, himself. It is possible to even overemphasize the saving habit. It is proper and desirable that everyone have a margin of safety, have some money in the bank, right? It is really wasteful not to have one, if you can have one, but it can be overdone. We teach children to save their money as an attempt to counteract thoughtlessness and selfish expenditure. That makes sense, right? But that has a value, but it's not always positive. It does not lead the child out into the safe and useful adventures of self-expression or self-expenditure. To teach a child to invest and use is better than to teach them to save. Most men who are laboriously saving a few dollars would do better to invest those few dollars first in themselves and then in some useful work. Eventually, they would have more money to save as a result. Young men ought to invest rather than save. They ought to invest in themselves and then create creative value. Okay, then I'm going to spend some time in this section. It's chapter called The Railroads, and it talks about, hey, this is the perfect illustration of the idea. It's like where you need to copy the how and not the what. And the fact that he needs certain railroads to transport his products all around the country, and they're so efficient, has become such a large problem at this point in his career that he's got to buy one. And this is where he really compares and contrasts. He's like, this is why I'm writing the book. This is my philosophy on how to build a business. And this is why, because how most businesses are poorly run. I'm entirely without any disposition to pose as a railroad authority. There may be railroad authorities, but if the service as rendered by the American Railroad today is the result of the accumulated railroad knowledge, then I cannot say that my respect for the usefulness of that knowledge is all that profound. Let me pause right in there. What is he saying? I see no evidence of this knowledge because it's not manifested in service. I have not the slightest doubt in the world that the active managers of the railways, the men who actually do the work, are entirely capable of conducting the railway of the country to the satisfaction of everyone. The men who know railroading have not been allowed to manage railroads. So that's his way of saying, hey, got no problem with the actual workers doing the job. It's the management and the administrators that are greedy and wasteful. And one thing he notices as soon as he buys the railroad is that they don't even actually reinvest. They just take the money as dividends, put it in their pocket, right? A very small fraction of the money earned by the railways has gone back into the rehabilitation of their properties. And so then he's examining, like, where's all this money going? And this goes back to the fact that Ford is very pro-founder and worker. He just despises anything that is not work directed at service. So he talks a lot of shit about bankers and lawyers and administrators and all that stuff. The natural ally of the banker is the lawyer. Such games as have been played on the railroads have needed expert legal advice. Lawyers, like bankers, know absolutely nothing about business. In our experience with the Detroit, the name of the railroad is irrelevant. In our experience with our railroad, we bought the railroad because its right-of-way interfered with some of our improvements on the River Rouge, which is this giant plant that he's making, okay? We did not buy it as an investment or because of its strategic position. We literally bought it because you're interfering with what we need to get done. And if you can't get the job done, then we'll just buy it and we'll do it ourselves. So it says since we bought the railroad, because it interfered with other plans, we have to do something with it. The only thing to do is to run it as a productive enterprise, applying it the exact same principles as applied to every department in our business. And one way to think about what he's saying there is like, listen, since I own this thing, it needs to be an asset and not a liability. And so I'm just going to use the same principles that I use for building cars as building the railroad. This is why, again, I'd pick up the whole book and just read this entire chapter. It's fascinating. It is true that applying the rule of maximum service at minimum cost, which he's always doing, right? That's a really great way. What does Henry Ford distill down to 5 words? Maximum service at a minimum cost. Maximum service at minimum cost. It's 5 words. 5-word summary of Henry Ford for you. Maximum service at minimum cost has caused the income of the road to exceed the outgo, meaning it was losing money, now it's turning a profit, which for that road represents a most unusual condition. See, he also kind of low-key funny, because kind of talking shit there. It has been represented that the change, because it's like, for this road, that's an unusual condition. How dare they make more? How do they have more revenue than expenses? What's happening here? It has been represented that the changes we have made, and remember that they've been made simply as part of the day's work, are peculiar. Oh, it says, I need to back up here. They're saying, hey, this is like revolutionary. Like how is this happening? And Ford's like, these are not revolutionary, and they could actually be applied to railroad management in general. And then he just has like a very common sense way of breaking down what needs to be fixed. He takes an inventory. Okay, this is the business I own now. These are the assets. These are the people working there. Like, let's just go through and do a thorough, is everything being done as good as it could do? And in other words, like what's about to happen is like the railroad was being run in the exact opposite way that Henry Ford would run a business. All of the rolling stock was in extremely bad condition, and a good part of it would not run at all. All the buildings were dirty, unpainted, and generally run down. The roadbed was something more than a streak of rust and something less than a railway. The repair shops were overmanned and under-machined. Practically everything connected with the operation was conducted with a maximum of waste. There was, however, an exceedingly ample executive and administrative department, and of course, a legal department. So listen to what he's saying. Where are they investing the money? In their trains? No. Are they investing the money in the track? Nope. Are they investing the money into the latest technology so that they can actually have more machines doing work instead of the men doing? No, they're not doing that. Where are they putting the money? There was an ample executive and administrative department, and of course, a legal department. So he's like, well, we're not going to do this. There had been an executive office in Detroit, and we closed that up, and then we put that administration in charge of one man. And so he goes through some of the numbers here. It's like, there's 25 administrators. Okay, see ya. We're going to have one dude. One dude's going to do all that. And he just goes through and does this line by line. All these unnecessary accounting and red tape were thrown out, and the payroll of the road was reduced from 2,700 people down to 1,650. And he goes on for quite a bit. I'm not going to read all that. I'm just going to give you what was my interpretation of what's taking place. Most businesses are overstaffed. The people running them are just not skillful operators. And so then he's like, okay, well, you can, there's also a way to increase money is that you can actually reduce time. We are not pouring in great amount of money. Everything is being done out of the earnings from the railroad. That is our policy. The time of our freight movements have been cut down about 2/3. And so he does that idea, the idea behind that sentence right there, he does that a lot. By increasing speed, he actually creates money. And there's very similar where Apple, that's one of the best things Tim Cook did at the very beginning when Steve Jobs came back to Apple, And Apple actually did this because they increased inventory turnover when Steve came back. And it was like, I forgot how much money saved, but it was a good amount. It was like tens of millions. It might even been like 200 million. It was a good amount of money. It's just like making things go faster. We are routing as much as we can around our own business over the road, but only because because on this road we get the best service. For years past, we had been trying to send freight over this road that I now own, that I previously didn't, is what he's telling us, right? Because it was conveniently located. But we'd never been able to use it to any extent because of the delayed deliveries. And another way to think about that is he made the risk in buying this railroad was actually really tiny to Henry Ford, because he knew as trying to be a customer of the business, he knew it was a poorly run business. So it's like there's obvious room for improvement here. They're just not doing it. So just increasing the obvious things makes this risk in buying the asset. I think he only paid like $5 million. I think he paid $5 million for the railroad, and I think he winds up selling it for like $30 million. Those numbers might be wrong, but it's like a very small investment. Like the risk is very tiny because from the outside, it's like, oh, these guys just don't know what they're doing. And his point was just like, wait, I actually fixed what was wrong with the road. Everybody previously just kept raising more money. So he says, will $1 billion solve this sort of trouble? No. $1 billion will only make the difficulty $1 billion worse. The purpose of the billion is simply to continue the present methods of railroad management. And it is because of the present methods that we had any railroad difficulties to begin with. So what is he saying? You're just throwing more money at incompetent people. Okay. And then we'll end where we began. This is Henry Ford summarizing his philosophy. It has been thought that business existed for profit. That is wrong. Business exists for service. If I did not think so, I would not keep working, for the money that I make is inconsequential. Business must always give more to the community than it takes away. In the first chapter was set forth my creed. Let me repeat it, for it is at the basis of all of our work. Number 1, an absence of fear of the future or a veneration for the past. One who fears the future, who fears failure, limits his activities. Failure is only the opportunity more intelligently to begin again. There is no disgrace in honest failure. There is disgrace in fearing to fail. What is past is useful only as it suggests ways and means for progress. Number 2, a disregard of competition. Whoever does a thing best ought to be the one to do it. Number 3, the putting of service before profit. Without a profit, business cannot extend. There is nothing inherently wrong about making a profit. Well-conducted business enterprises cannot fail to return a profit, but profit must and inevitably will come as a result of good service. It cannot be the basis. It must be the result of service. Number 4, manufacturing is not buying low and selling high. It is the process of buying materials fairly and with the smallest possible addition of cost, transforming those materials into a consumable product and distributing it to the customer. There is always something to be done in this world and only ourselves to do it. Every advance begins in a small way and with the individual. And that is where I'll leave it. For the full story, highly recommend buying the book. If you buy the book using the link that's in the show notes, you'll be supporting the podcast at the same time. As you're buying more books and reading more books, make sure you get the Readwise app. Readwise is where I store all of my notes and all of my highlights for every single book that I read. I've done this for years, and it's one of the main benefits of listening to this podcast, because not only have I read over 100,000 pages in the history of entrepreneurship, but the way I don't forget these things is because I put them in Readwise and I read them over and over and over again. It is by far the best app I pay for, and I could not make the podcast without it. So founders tend to read a ton, and if you're going to read, you might as well remember what you read. And so if you go to, I'll leave I should know the link by now. Jeez. I'll leave the link in the show notes in case I'm wrong, but I think it's readwise.io/founders, and you can get 60 days free. It's fantastic. That is 266 books down, 1,000 to go, and I'll talk to you again soon.